My presentation is on Mexico, the first letter of the mint that you are learning about this morning. My name is Tony Payan. I'm the director of the Mexico Center at the Baker Institute at Rice University. So I'm right just up the road from there. The Mexico Center is a think tank dedicated to thinking about Mexico, the binational relationship, and of course public policy in Mexico. So that's going to be my presentation. I'm going to try to cover about 5 different issues in a few minutes. One of them is the Mexican economy and the outlook of the Mexican economy in 2015. The second topic will be Mexican politics, what's coming up, what should we expect. A couple of issues that I think are concerning in regard to society in Mexico, social issues. Another issue will be security, a lot of concerns about security in Mexico. And of course, the last is immigration, which I am sure many of you are familiar with because you have a lot of students from Mexico or Mexican-American students. I want to suggest that of all the countries in the world, Mexico has a deep impact on the United States. Mexico is a very key country because it has the ability to affect American lives. Let me give you a couple of stats that will bring it home to you how important it is to understand Mexico. Number one, there are now over 50 million Hispanics in the United States, of which 2/3, 35 million, are Mexicans and Mexican Americans. That means that Mexico is now a key source of genes in the American population. Mexicans are reaching a high level of presence in the United States. If you think about Germany and Britain as major sources of immigration in American history, you have to place now Mexico up on top because it is beginning to be an important component of the American experience. The second is after the North American Free Trade Agreement, the degree of economic integration between the two countries has become such that now 6 million jobs in the United States depend on exports to Mexico. So Mexico is key in promoting jobs in the United States, exports from the United States, and is one of the major markets for American exports from grains, agricultural exports, all the way to high-tech exports such as computers. It is also a major destination of American migrants. 1.2 million Americans have made Mexico their home. And it is a major destination of tourism. More Americans live in Mexico than anywhere in the world, and than all of Europe combined. Of course, Mexicans are the number one source of tourism to the United States, sending tourism to Mexico. We've seen it at the Galleria, sending more shoppers and tourists than Europe, than certainly the UK, France, and Germany combined. So the integration, the level of integration that has occurred in North America, certainly in the last 20 years, has been truly, truly phenomenal. The cultural impact that Mexico has had on the United States is also quite formidable. It's been known for a while, but certainly in places like Texas and California, the two largest economies in the United States, the Mexican presence is quite large. But not only. We now know that many other states are interested in a relationship with Mexico and heavily exploit their investment in Mexico and Mexican investment in the United States, of course, because states as far north as Michigan now have an active economic relationship with Mexico. So I want to make the case that Mexico is a country that we have to understand and we have to work on, because I think it's important that we understand all these linkages between the two countries. Mexico will loom large, very large, on the binational relationship, probably above many, many other countries, certainly among the top 5 relationships for the United States, with the ability to truly impact the U.S. So let me get, having made the case for that, let me just get to, were we able to get the PowerPoint up? They're working on that. All right. Let me just begin to say something about the economic relationship between Mexico and the United States. Certainly NAFTA set the relationship to a new level. Before 1994, Mexico and the United States had a trading relationship that amounted in terms of dollars to about $40 billion. Over the last 20 years, 21 years now, the relationship has grown economically to almost $600 billion. That is a 14-fold growth. NAFTA has certainly propelled that relationship, and manufacturing has become fully integrated between the two countries. We now have experiences such as Mexicali, Baja California, where satellites are built and the equipment crosses the border up to 7 times. A component part is added in California, in Southern California, goes over to Mexico for additional work, goes back to California for software, comes back to Mexico for another component, goes back and forth until the product is finished. And then you have productive chains such as the Querétaro, Mexico, Kansas City, Montreal axis, which essentially means that a car is made in all 3 countries. And Mexico has indeed become a country that is now the 7th largest producer of vehicles in the world, and it is a country that has displaced Japan as an exporter of cars to the United States. All the major car companies now in the world have a presence in Mexico, and of course the United States, being a major car market, benefits from that because many of these vehicles end up in our streets. So you're probably driving a vehicle that was at least in part built in Mexico. Planes too. The aviation industry in Mexico is taking off to the extent that some component parts of the plane you fly, wherever you go, were probably made in Mexico. Mexico is a major destination of grain from Iowa and Kansas and Nebraska. It is a key market for American agriculture, but at the same time, the United States is a key market for Mexican agriculture. There has been a complementarity that has been built over time so that the 50% of the tomatoes and probably 80-90% of the avocados that you consume are of Mexican origin. So there's a lot of back and forth between the two countries. And I think the two nations have taken advantage of their comparative advantage, whether it's labor, prices, climate for specific goods and products, and technology and such, so that the economies are becoming increasingly complementary. We certainly should expect this to grow, although NAFTA, I think, has reached its limits. NAFTA grew the frame on which the two countries could expand their relationship 14-fold in the last 21 years. But I think the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the TTIP, the agreement that is being negotiated between North America and Europe across the Atlantic, so there's 2 large agreements that are being currently negotiated, and there's a controversy among Democrats and Republicans on this, and the negotiations are nonetheless continuing. And they will likely dilute NAFTA, but because the level of privilege and access that TPP and TTIP grant to partners is greater than NAFTA, which means NAFTA will likely be diluted inside this much greater pool of access, economic and financial access. But Mexico's proximity to the United States, I think, will make it such that the relationship will continue to grow. I've argued in the past that Mexico does not, that the United States does not have an articulate and comprehensive foreign policy towards Mexico. It's been mostly centered on security and drugs, but I think that we know that we need to push Mexico on other social issues. Now, of course, this can mean that there are some advantages and disadvantages to the binational relationship, mostly because the more dependent partner is Mexico. Mexico is dependent on the United States for 85% of its exports, and of course for a very large percentage of its foreign direct investment and foreign indirect investment. There is Mexican investment flowing to the United States in the billions of dollars, but it nowhere comes close to the American investment in Mexico. So clearly the two countries are becoming interdependent, but Mexico stands to become more and more dependent on the binational relationship, to the extent that one of the graphs that you may have in front of you on the economic prospects of Mexico show that Mexico is more sensitive to the American ups and downs. When the U.S. economy does very well, Mexico does slightly better. But when the American economy does badly, Mexico does worse. So the ups and downs of the Mexican economy follow the ups and downs of the American economy, but more dramatically so. So clearly, Mexico is considerably more sensitive to the American economy. The problem that Mexico currently has is not one of prosperity in some sense. It is a paradox, because while the country has been growing, over the last 20 to 30 years, it's become heavily dependent on exports. 60% of the Mexican economy today is exports, 85% of which go to the United States. So it's heavily hedged to the American economy. Now, the Mexican government has actually been trying to diversify its relationships, and Mexico has signed upwards of 44 free trade agreements with the world, from Israel to Japan to South Korea to the European Union, countries in South America, and certainly the North American Free Trade Agreement. So Mexico is trying to diversify so as to lessen its own sensitivity to a dependency on the American economy, but it has not managed to do so. Most of its exports still go to the United States. Now, that's a critical point, because I think that in Mexico, the economy, the export-led economy, has not truly translated into a prosperity for all Mexicans. There is something about the Mexican tax system, something about the Mexican informal economy, and something about the government's investment in development that has not made that wealth that Mexico has produced in the last years to trickle down to all Mexicans. And so Mexico remains one of the most unequal countries in the world. And I wanted to point out one thing here. You can see Mexico's among the OECD countries. These are the wealthiest countries in the world. The United States is third to last from tax collection. Obviously, Europe ranks very high in tax collection, but Mexico is even further down. In fact, it's last. Mexico collects less than 20% of its GDP in taxes. That means that the government does not have sufficient money to invest in infrastructure, education, healthcare, and such. Most of it goes to social programs. And by the way, here's the sensitivity. You can see the blue in Mexico and then the red in the United States. So it follows the ups and downs very closely, but more dramatically so. You can see Mexico considerably more sensitive to the American economy. Well, I talked about that. One of the reasons that Mexico doesn't collect enough taxes is because there is 58% of the Mexican economy is probably informal. In other words, Mexicans are not formally employed. They sell stuff in the streets, and you can see it when you travel. There's a lot of informal economic activity, and it's very difficult for the government to actually capture that activity and then impose taxes on them. Most people are really just making goods and selling goods informally in the streets, or they buy them and then they go sell them in the streets. That makes it difficult for the government to collect any more revenue. And of course, the tax brackets are so low that most of the tax burden falls on the middle class, and many people, upwards of 60% of Mexicans, pay very few or no taxes. That makes it quite difficult for Mexico to invest, and it also creates an imbalance in the equality in the country, and it means that there's a lot of people that will simply not benefit from government investment. Now, the other point that I want to mention here is the weak internal market. When you have an informal economy, you have low wages, and you have these kinds of conditions, most Mexicans cannot afford the goods they make. So even though Mexican exports are now 6% of the GDP, most Mexicans would actually not be able to buy what they make. And so Mexico has, for example, a very low capacity, or the market has a very low capacity to buy the cars that Mexicans make. So most of the cars that Mexicans make end up in Canada, the United States, and Europe, but Mexicans themselves cannot afford them. So in the end, there is a weak internal market. And Mexico continues to bet on an economic model of cheap labor. In fact, Mexico has expressed a certain degree of pride in the fact that Mexican labor is today cheaper than Chinese labor. And therefore, some companies are beginning to return from China to Mexico. Well, I am not sure if this is something that Mexico ought to be proud of, because there are consequences to that. There is a weak internal market, and that means that Mexico will continue to be heavily dependent, hitched to the American economy, and heavily dependent on the American market. Predictable, but the Mexican government has not taken any corrective mechanisms to strengthen its middle class. About 50%, 45 to 50% of its population is middle class, but then the other 50% is really mostly poor people, and so they cannot themselves consume heavily, and therefore the market will continue to be weak. The government has recognized that and has begun to pass some reforms, 13 of them, of which I just want to point out some structural reforms on labor. One of the interesting things about Mexico is that it made a diagnosis, which I'm not sure it's correctly made, that one of the problems is that Mexican labor law is too rigid, that it looks a lot more like certain states' labor rights. It's very difficult to fire people, so it's very difficult to, so people are afraid of, companies are afraid to hire because it is very difficult to fire. And so the flexibilizing the hiring and firing process, looking a little bit more like Texas, right to work kind of state, is the solution. So Mexico is lowering the benefits for workers and flexibilizing the firing and hiring mechanisms so that in the hopes that that will activate the labor market. I am not sure that that will work, because there is some evidence that states that are not as heavily right to work as Texas actually do better in social equality. So I'm not sure that the bet is right, but it is consistent with the neoliberal economic model that Mexico has been implementing in the last few years. In other words, stronger workers' rights probably make for greater equality, and poor or lower worker rights, lower levels of unionization actually make for greater inequality. So Mexico may actually be betting on the wrong side. We will see. We'll have to study that. Education. The education system, which was the pride of Mexico for a long time, because from the 30s to the 70s, Mexico built an education system and pushed forward with the government as the engine of education in Mexico to provide elementary and secondary school to most Mexicans. And to this day, certainly the Mexican education system achieved great accomplishments and brought literacy in Mexico to 97-98%, and provided almost 100% elementary school education, but then it begins to taper off on the secondary school to 80%, and then when it goes to prep school, which is roughly high school, the last 3 years of high school, it certainly falls down to less than 40%, and then college ready or college education is probably less than 10%. So clearly the government made efforts over the years to provide a basic education to the country, but today it's simply not enough, and today most Mexicans do not have the opportunity to go to college. College is simply accessible to a few, and I think that is part of the fact that Mexico is betting on labor and not human capital. What's the difference between these two? Well, labor is a point of view that will look at a human being as hands and feet, as sheer labor for a maquiladora industry or manufacturing. Human capital means that we look at individuals primarily as brains that just happen to have to come accompanied by a body. Mexico looks at bodies, and the brain is less important. That, I think, is the wrong way to look at people, and of course Mexico is making a bet that cheap labor will eventually, by sheer force of time, produce a middle class, and then it'll turn and produce human capital. I don't think that that is probably the strategy that is going to pay off, but that's the Mexican bet. Energy reform, for a long time, energy, particularly oil, because Mexico is a major producer of oil, was key in Mexico, certainly since the 1970s. Mexico gets about 35 to 40% of its federal budget from oil revenue. And Mexico is a major exporter of oil, particularly to the United States again. But the problem is that although Mexico has ample reserves of oil and gas, including shale gas, some of the most important reserves of shale gas in the world, and some of the most important oil reserves in the Gulf of Mexico, we're quite familiar with it in Texas because Mexico and Texas are almost a territorial extension of each other. So the shale gas in the Eagle Ford in South Texas goes well deep into Mexico, and there may be even more shale gas on the Mexican side than on the Texas side. So clearly the resources, the proven resources are there, but the investment, the capital, and the technical know-how are not there. Pemex is a bloated company that operates with 155,000 workers, almost as social employment in many ways. It's a company, a similar company in Texas, in the United States, operates with about 1/5 those many workers, about 30,000 instead of 150,000. So clearly, the government used Pemex as a source of social employment. It used it as a source of revenue, and it starved it. The consequence of starving Pemex was, of course, that Pemex itself did not have the additional capital to invest in exploration and exploitation of the new discovered energy resources, but also it means that the government became excessively dependent on oil revenue for its federal budget, and that goes well while the barrel of oil is 100. but it means that Mexico is about to face a crunch, an economic crunch, because the barrel of oil, Mexican oil, is particularly dirty, so it takes a lot more to refine. And so it's about $37, $38 now. It's collapsed by about 63% in its price. So clearly Mexico is having to review its federal budget, is going to face a crunch. And also because the technology and the investment, the capital investment, were not there to tap into those resources, it means that Mexican production of energy, particularly oil, declined since I think it peaked in 2005, 2006 at 3.6 million barrels of oil a day, and it's declined by almost 40%. So the decline plus the drop in prices is certainly putting Mexico in a crunch, and the government has decided that it's time to open the energy sector. It's going to keep Pemex. Pemex will stay the way it is. Pemex will be, the tax burden on Pemex will be eased somewhat. Pemex will be liberated to do business with foreign companies, and then Pemex will be given some blocks of oil and gas to explore and exploit, but then the ones that Pemex cannot use will be then concessioned out, licensed to foreign investment. For the first time since 1938, Mexico will allow foreign companies to come in and tap into the energy resources of the country, which are quite vast. Texas obviously stands to gain from this. A lot of Texas companies, and certainly Houston, stand to gain from this. I'll stop there on the economic issues. I just want to point out something about Mexican growth, because it's important to understand that. Mexico has a problem of no growth, and we don't effectively understand why Mexico does not grow. But if you compare it to the other economy that is kind of efficient and completely liberalized in Latin America, Chile has essentially doubled its real gross domestic product per working age person between 1980 and 2005, whereas Mexico has stayed fairly flat. Mexico has grown at about a rate of 2%, average 2% per year. That is simply not enough, because a lot of the growth in any country is explained by two things. One, population growth, and productivity growth. And if you have high population growth, then most of the additional economic activity is really explainable by population growth, not by productivity growth. So Mexicans have been particularly unproductive, and most of the Mexican economy has really grown on the basis of population growth. If you have more people, you got more economic activity. But each worker is not producing more for the same dollar and the same hour that they work, which is the only other real true source of economic growth. And I think Mexico has that problem. And the government has not really truly addressed the issue of productivity. Now, that's not for lack of work. Mexicans have ranked consistently among the hardest working people in the world. They work 10, 12, and 14 hours a day. They work more hours than Americans do on average, and yet they're not becoming more productive. That means they don't have the technology, the tools, the knowledge, or the skills. They're still working with their hands. It means that there is not enough investment on people so that people can then become more productive and have a greater output per dollar per hour worked. And of course, well, I'll go on to the political side. Political prospects. In July of 2015, we will have the midterm elections. Mexico had elections in 2012. President Peña won the election, as you well know. Most of us in Texas certainly are aware of that. Mexico will have midterm elections in July 2015. They're coming up. We'll be looking at them very, very closely. Here are the political parties. There's two other political parties that are not portrayed there that were recently created. Three actually political parties that were recently created. They're not here. I'll talk about them in a minute. This is the party that governed Mexico for 2 terms between 2000 and 2012. That's the party that governed Mexico between 1920 29 and 2000 for 71 years. That's the leftist party formed in 1988. This is the Communist Party, the equivalent, the Workers' Party. This is the Green Party. That's another leftist party, and that's a right-wing party, even further to the right than the PAN. It's the Nueva Alianza. I think Mexico's democracy is imperfect. Everybody had high hopes that Mexico's democracy would actually improve, that people's participation and genuine devolution of power to the states and the municipalities and genuine accountability, transparency, and participation and popular participation in politics and decision making would grow after the 2000 election. And yet I think that Mexico has remained a poor electoral democracy. Even if it is an electoral democracy, that is, we have competition and contestation, there is still, at the state and local level, a heavy manipulation of public resources to favor the PRI, which still controls most of the states and the majority of the 2,440 municipalities, counties, that Mexico is composed of. So because they control most of the local resources, they still tend to manipulate the electoral system in their favor. That is probably how they won power back in 2012, and they are now trying to cement their power at the federal level as well. And I suspect that there will be a lot of resource manipulation in their favor to try to gain control of Congress in the July 2015 elections. They do a lot of vote buying and co-optation of political will. One of the latest programs in the media is, of course, the fact that the government, the federal government, and many of the local and state governments controlled by the PRI are delivering flat screens TVs to all Mexicans, or millions of flat screens TVs. But this is really something that will be going on for the next 2 to 3 months, probably in an effort to buy political will. Some people would call it outright vote buying. So Mexico remains really an imperfect democracy. There's something about the accountability. Now, the personalistic political culture that the PRI was based on, the presidentialist system, is back. In fact, many of the behaviors that Peña exhibits and his political party exhibit are back to that kind of personalistic, yes, Mr. President, whatever you say, Mr. President. The famous joke in Mexico, what time is it? Asks the president, and his assistant says, whatever time you want it to be, Mr. President. That's the time that it is. Corruption. The political party has returned, and apparently it is a little bit like the Bourbon family in Europe. The Bourbons, they learned nothing and they forgot nothing. The party is back with heavy levels of corruption. In fact, President Peña is under fire because he has been found to have dozens of properties that were gifts or sales at a very low price by companies that have gained juicy billion-dollar contracts from the state where he was governor before, and then from the federal government today. So the president has become very, very unpopular today, and Mexico has been essentially exposed for the levels of corruption. Now, this is dramatic in some sense because the president passed these reforms, and a lot of the implementation of these reforms depended on the level of legitimacy that he enjoyed. Well, his level of legitimacy has essentially been corroded to the point that he is risking losing the elections in July. Now, I want to show you what the polls look like for the elections in July. I hope I can manage to... there you go. I thought it was this one. No wonder it wasn't working. Okay, I'm going to try to show you the electoral preferences of Mexicans in this election. Let's see if I can get it. Yeah, there it is. Those are, let's see if I can reduce the size of the screen so you can see it better. Oh, you can see it there. I think I have a smaller view here. Here's the electoral preferences. The President's Party now, these are the political parties. I'll bring it down a little bit. I will reduce it to about 75%. Yeah, that's better. All right. So you can see what Mexicans are thinking, especially given the corruption scandals. The PRI stands at a brute preference of 31% and then an effective electoral preference of 23%. I assume that the electoral preference means not only who do you intend to vote for, but do you intend to vote at all? And then we discard those that say, I don't intend to vote. Even though I would prefer the PRI, I don't intend to vote. So you discount those. So the preference really is 23% PRI, 20% PAN, the effective, and then the PRD 9%, the Green Party 7%, Morena, which is a radical populist party at 7%, and then all the other smaller parties at less than that. If they don't get 2%, which is this red line, they will disappear. So that may disappear, that may disappear, those parties may disappear if they don't get above 2%. And so the larger parties will probably stay in power. So this is how the election is turning out. I think the president is betting on gaining the majority in Congress and the Senate, but it looks like the polls at least show that Mexicans are not going to be willing to give the president a majority in Congress, which will complicate the implementation of the reforms, and it will certainly make the 2018 election considerably more interesting. That's where we stand politically now. So the result is political fragmentation, and that's the scenario that we face in Mexico today. Now, politically, let me see okay. The society, I just want to point out a couple of things about Mexico. I mentioned the economic effect of looking at people as hands and feet instead of brains. It's the way you perceive people and the way you see people. And I think Mexico has made the mistake, but it's kind of a colonial era mistake of looking at people as simply labor, as help, as hands and feet to help manufacturing. Mexico is not really a meritocracy. There's a sense of entitlement, particularly by the European population, which is about 10% in Mexico. And there's a strong correlation, I call it the pigmentocracy. There's a strong correlation in Mexico between the color of your skin and your socioeconomic status. So the darker you are, the more likely you will be poor, ignorant, rural, and all the different indicators that mean that you are a disenfranchised and disadvantaged individual in society. So Mexico has a racial problem that's not been talked about, in a class problem that has not been talked about. And so as long as and by the way, the PRI tends to bet on that group, the very poor. The paradox of the PRI today is that they tend to bet on the very poor as their core electoral base. But they do it by co-opting them and creating social programs for that group to ensure a certain degree of political will and loyalty, and then keep winning elections that way. The middle class tends to vote differently, tends to vote PAN, or it tends to defect altogether if they are disaffected with the political performance of the party. So I think Mexico is an issue. There's an issue there. And unfortunately, Mexico is becoming an old country. The fertility rate in Mexico, if you can see that, used to be 7.3 children per woman in 1960. It's now 2.2 and dropping, which means the Mexican population, and this may actually explain why the tide of Mexican migration to the United States has essentially become zero. There are almost zero immigrants coming from Mexico today. And of course, look at the US, which is 2%. 2%, two children per woman is considered replacement level, which means the stabilization of the population. Anything below that means that the population will begin to decrease. That's Japan and Austria and a lot of Europe. So Mexico is clearly approaching this level. And the worst part of it is, the worst thing that can happen to somebody is to be old and poor. That is a terrible situation that Mexicans may have to experience. In terms of security, I think President Calderon in 2006, when he came into office in December, diagnosed the issue as primarily one of institutional weakness, particularly judicial, the administration of justice system, police, courts, lawyers, the entire judicial system. He diagnosed it as weak, and he diagnosed the problem as one of co-optation. He thought that perhaps organized crime in Mexico had penetrated the administration of justice institutions and even the political institutions to the extent that he needed to rescue that. Unfortunately, he did not have the tools to confront organized crime, and what he did was mobilize or deploy the military, which was counterproductive because then the military began to acquire increasing law enforcement responsibilities, which are not and should not really be the work or the job of the military. So in Mexico, this became a problem. The result was that the crime rate, which had dropped in Mexico and had been dropping through the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and even into the 2000s, you can see the drop. It continued to drop. Eventually spiked up, and it's stabilized at around 20 murders per 100,000 people. By the way, in spite of the fact that it was a dramatic rise in the murder rate in Mexico, you can see here Honduras is 80 plus, and then Central America, other Central American countries are still at about 40. Mexico is stabilized at about 20. So clearly, even though there was a big spike in insecurity and other kinds of crime, Mexico remained well below most of Central America, and certainly below Colombia and Brazil and Argentina and much of Africa and many other places. So in some ways, but this scared Mexicans and scared them to the point that they voted the PRI back into power, except that the PRI has now exhibited the same old corrupt habits. So Mexicans will have to make a choice in July as to what exactly they want to do, whether they want to continue to consolidate the PRI in power or they want to opt for a third party. To me, the interesting thing is that the party that stands to win the most is probably Morena and the PRD, the leftist party that is considerably more populist and less friendly to reforms in the economic sector. So clearly Mexico is at a crossroads in which they'll have to choose. Peña, when he came in 2012, overlearned the lesson of the increase in the murder rate here, and he overlearned it and decided to largely ignore the problem and focus instead on the economic reforms in the hopes that that would ease public opinion and the whole problem would just simply go away. Well, it's coming back to bite him because clearly the murder rate has remained at about 20, not much lower, and some of the criminal gangs have actually diversified, fragmented, and began to victimize Mexicans through extortion, kidnapping, bribery, and a lot of other crime. This is just the murder rate right here, but there's many other there are many other criminal activities going on in Mexico, and we don't know how much because probably as much as 90% of all crimes in Mexico are not really reported. Most Mexicans simply say, well, there's nothing to do. We lost the car, or we lost this or that, or somebody broke into the house, and they simply don't call the police. First of all, they don't trust them. And second, there is no hope that they would do anything anyway. So most Mexicans do not report crime. So we don't really know the extent of crime. But Peña has clearly failed in his strategy. Calderón diagnosed it, as I mentioned to you, a problem of institutions and addressed them by force. And it really got a dramatic response. Peña went all the other way, overlearned the lesson, and decided not to do anything about it. And of course, now he's facing a problem. A couple of other things. Migration, to sort of begin to end. Look, 34 million, about 35 million Mexicans and Mexican Americans in the United States, of which 11.4 or so, almost 12 million, are Mexican born. So a whole 10% of all of the population of Mexico, just Mexican born, live in the United States, 10%. It is pretty high. Most countries, most countries send immigrants, but Mexico has sent an enormous amount of immigrants to the United States. If you consider that there's about 115 million Mexicans, and you think about 12 or 11.5 million native-born Mexicans living in the United States. That's 10% of the population. That is a considerable amount of Mexicans that live in the United States today. Many of them, of course, without papers. About 5 million undocumented Mexicans live in the United States, and I'm sure you have plenty of experience with that. So you have that problem. Now, to me, the birth rate and the economic growth and the increase in employment in Mexico has stabilized Mexican migration. And also the United States has increased its investment, about $18 billion a year spent on border control, to the extent that, that the United States now has an effective operational control of the U.S.-Mexico border. I have argued in the past that the American border control agencies, particularly the Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection, are exploiting the situation and have a stake in maintaining the discourse, the narrative of chaos on the border, because they benefit in terms of budget and personnel and such. The reality is that they actually have an extraordinary operational control of the border, and we ought to begin to hold them accountable for every additional dollar that they come and request for border control. The immigration issue is largely under control. So when Governor Perry came out and said that he was going to deploy 1,000 more troops, guard troops to the border, and he was going to spend $800 million on the border and such, I think that we ought to begin to sort of question exactly what they want that money for. I think we have not been very good at questioning anything about the border and demanding accountability per dollar invested in border control, particularly when we think that the immigration wave from Mexico and Central America reached its peak in 2005 at 1.2 million apprehensions, really the most accurate number that we have so far of individuals trying to cross the border without papers, to 470,000, a collapse of almost 2/3. And finally, I guess that's it. That's the immigration control. And I think that gives us about 5 minutes for questions, if you have any. Yeah.
Yes, I've often heard that the Mexico economy is stymied by its oligarchical approach at the top, and that if you had greater competition in many of the industries, and I don't mean to emphasize Sam, but in the communications interest, for example, you would have hundreds of thousands of new high-tech jobs that would be created and would boom the economy. How much does that play in the slowing down and the stymieing of the Mexican economy?
It is true that beginning in the 1990s, the Mexican economy was supposed to open most of its sectors, except energy, to foreign investment and competition. Technically, that's the way the economic model was supposed to work. This is what was demanded of the North American Free Trade Agreement. However, the devil is always in the details. And in many, many different sectors in Mexico, the regulatory framework that was put in place, that was the conceptual opening, the law as it was passed in the treaties. But in the regulatory component, the Mexican government was lobbied enough that it was maneuvered into favoring, through regulation, Mexican investors and producers, certainly in some sectors like the telecommunications sector. The telecommunications reform that was just passed is presumably eliminating some of those regulations by law or through law that will open up the sector. It is estimated that the opening in the telecom sector may, if implemented right, add as much as a 1 percentage point growth in GDP to the Mexican economy. We don't know yet. I mean, this is obviously a project that we're still developing at the Mexico Center to look into how much impact that would be in the implementation of telecom. That is one sector, though. There are many other privileges. I had a question for a famous economist in Mexico that came to visit the Institute, and I said, is there a capitalist oligarchy in Mexico? Is there crony capitalism in Mexico? Is there a government that privileges certain industries and certain people in those industries and therefore maintains the economy closed? And he said no, but I said yes. I think that honestly, the Mexican government has privileged certain people that maintain a lid on competition, and in fact, to the extent that Mexicans pay 40% more for internet than Americans pay, in a country where the salaries are a fraction of what the salaries are in the United States. So clearly it's got to have an impact. And by the way, the investment, in an essay that somebody wrote for us in the summer for the Mexico Center, the investment in telecommunications has actually not been what it's been in other countries either. Because if you have a monopoly, you don't have an incentive to invest and upgrade your infrastructure, since you are essentially becoming a rentist capitalist and extracting resources from Mexicans. When you have that kind of structural constraint and competition, it definitely reduces the ability of Mexicans to bring prices down and to compete and to become innovative. It puts a lid on a lot of different conditions, and I think that's the case in Mexico. And that's the case in energy as well, because the Mexican government is liberalizing the energy sector, but it's maintaining control of gasoline prices. So the gasoline prices will not move. The investment behind it will move, but at the pump, Mexicans will continue to face high gasoline prices. Yes?
The immigration stabilizing, larger numbers, but on a smaller scale, we're seeing a large increase in the number of immigrants coming into our schools in this area. Many from Central America. The balance has shifted a lot more.
Right.
So that has had an impact on us. Obviously, they've come for
Yeah.
the most part through Mexico,
Right.
and not everyone has come. Has that had an impact on the social structure, economic structure, supporting so many migrants coming through from Central America?
Yeah, I think the numbers are enlightening, and here's where I think we're looking at them. In 2005, we saw the peak of migrants apprehended at the border, 1.2 million. The last number that came out of the US government was 479. Now, think about that number for a second. In 2005, 10 years ago, we had a lower operational control, which means many more migrants probably made it through. And if you still manage to apprehend 1.2 million, how many do you think might actually make it through? Let's say that 50%, in 2005, 50% made it through. Just to give a number. That means that 2.4 million people tried to cross. Half were apprehended because operational control was low. Half of the Border Patrol agents, no border wall, less ditches, less fences, less sensors, less cameras, less drones, less everything. So let's say that 50% made it. That means 2.4 million people tried to cross. Today, the number of apprehensions is 479,000 in the fiscal year that ended in October, federal fiscal year. But I think the operational control has so improved from 10 years ago that we're probably apprehending 80 to 90% of those who try to cross. So the people that try to cross is probably closer to 500,000 to 600,000, with 479,000 of them actually apprehended. So the problem of immigration is actually collapsed. I think the Republicans are not justified in using this issue not to resolve the problem of those that are already here. The operational control of the border is already there, and we ought to demand higher accountability from the border agencies. But in any event, of those 479,000 reported apprehensions, 51% were Central Americans and 49% were Mexicans. So Mexicans are coming at a tune of 230,000 apprehensions, using the number of apprehensions as a proxy for as a good representative number of the people that are trying to cross. 230,000. But the Obama administration has actually arrested and deported 400,000 per year, which means that Mexican migration is not at net zero, it's actually negative. And there are more Mexicans going out than there are Mexicans coming in today. So the numbers clearly tell us a very different story than the general discourse and narrative is trying to tell us. In South America, I was in Costa Rica and El Salvador in the last semester, looking at the issue of Central American migration. That continues to be a problem, but I think there is one big question that we don't know the answer to yet, and that is, what expels most of Central Americans that make the trek north? Is it the economic conditions or is it the security conditions? Most American agencies will say, especially the Pentagon and Homeland Security will say, that it's the security situation. The argument that was presented in Costa Rica last week, I was in Costa Rica last Monday, a week from Monday, I guess, 2 weeks ago, almost. The argument that was presented is that the economic conditions, not the security conditions, push more people out. I think that's a hypothesis that needs to be resolved. Yeah.
So what do you see for the reason is to explain the decline in immigration? Is it because of stepped up border patrols? Is it because of economic conditions maybe improving or people being more optimistic about their own prospects? I mean, what do you think is possible?
Yeah, the first instinct is we don't know, because we don't know the answer to the hypothesis or the competing hypothesis that I just presented. What is it that pushes most people out of their country, particularly in the case of Mexico and Central America? Is it the security situation or is it the economic situation? What is interesting here is to sort of dissect the numbers, because if you look at the security situation, it seems to me that the people that leave Mexico are really middle class people that are affected by extortions, kidnappings, and such. So the security situation seems to push not poor people but middle class people that end up in Little Mexico, also known as the Woodlands. Right? Now, that's one phenomenon that we see today. But the other phenomenon is what is pushing the poor. And it seems to me that the economic conditions is what push, or what actually pushes people the most. The economic conditions on the ground are very dramatically different in different parts of Mexico. So what we intend to do is to try to figure out, and Central American, we're trying to figure out that with another scholar, another academic, to kind of break it down by municipio, which is kind of by county, and see and find the economic conditions per county, and then the migrant sending numbers per county to see if we see a strong correlation, and see if, and then also test the security conditions per county and see what's pushing people out. I suspect that the economic conditions, and that means Central America is at a disadvantage, more so than Mexico, because in Mexico, slowly but surely, economic opportunities are being produced, not at the rate that it should. And many Mexicans are simply saying, look, it's not worth going to crossing the border like this. You know, Mexicans were used to crossing the border a lot with a greater ease, and now it's not as easy. So many Mexicans are giving it up. The visa overstays are another issue. That's a different problem.
So how do you take the reality that you're describing and change America's perception, or this small, politically active group perception?
Well, I think that one of the things that I do when I give talks, particularly to groups that are more, especially now that I find myself in Houston, I used to be in El Paso, that I find myself in Houston with different audiences, some of them considerably more conservative and closed and anti-immigrant, is to try to tell them the numbers and have the numbers tell them the story. Because I think that one thing is to have opinions and developed opinions, and we do not change opinions very easily. Opinions are very hard to change. They take a lot longer to change, and they change more slowly. And in the beginning, when we accumulate evidence against our opinions, we tend to see them as anomalies. And only over time, when much evidence is accumulated, do we then tend to reverse our opinion. But opinions are not wrong. Opinions are opinions. So I try to let the facts talk for themselves. And at the Mexico Center, the Baker Institute, we simply try to put the facts out there, the evidence, and then slowly, like a drop on rock, let the daily drop eventually break the rock. But it will take a long time. Yes. One more. Yes, thank you.
Back to the study that you were talking about, where you're looking at the different municipalities, and those areas where the cartels are really strong, do you consider that an economic or a security issue?
Well, let me just give you a very quick story. Obviously, I'll do some injustice to this, but crime in Mexico has also evolved. We have to understand that in the 80s and 90s, certainly in the 80s, there used to be a single large criminal organization that controlled most of the drug trafficking to the United States, and it was based out of Guadalajara, Mexico, for the most part. After a certain breakdown in negotiations and reaccommodation in the 90s, they settled into 4 large organizations, which curiously have Mexican names, but they're really transnational organizations. The Tijuana, the Sinaloa, the Juarez, and the Gulf cartels. 4. And they control the corridors, the drug corridors, mostly territorially, staying out of each other's ways for the most part, sometimes specializing on some drugs and others. The consequence of Mr. Peña's strategy, Mr. Calderon's strategy right here, is essentially to use a hammer and heavily mobilize the military and the police and hammer away at these cartels and decapitate them, to the extent that he created a lot of intercartel and intracartel fights for succession, for territory, and all the kinds of consequences, to the point that the country is now so fragmented that there might be probably hundreds of different groups. Al-Qaeda is a typical example. Once we decapitated Al-Qaeda, we lost control of the cells. The same thing happened in crime in Mexico. Once they decapitated and really weakened the large structures, the criminals didn't go away. They simply reorganized into small cells. So you have the Fantasia problem in the movie, where you had one big broom and then he wanted to do the job more quickly, so he broke it into a bunch of brooms and then he couldn't control all the brooms. That Mickey Mouse, I think? That's what it was. That's what you have in Mexico. So what you have is a greater diversification of different cells that are looking for economic opportunity. Most of the crime in Mexico is not terrorism, because terrorism has essentially a political objective. It's economic crime. It's about extracting resources. And so a lot of these groups turned to the Mexican population. And so extortion went up, kidnappings for ransom went up, burglaries and robberies and assaults and all kinds of things went up. And the government was simply institutionally unable to get on top of that. And so it further weakened the government. And of course, many other organizations continue to do the drug business towards the United States and then to sort of grow the market in Mexico itself. So you have a much more complicated problem than we now understand. I think our understanding of crime in Mexico is actually a little outdated, and we're kind of beginning to get a hold of what is really, really happening in Mexico. All right, I think that's enough. Thank you. Thank you.